I always thought of myself as rational, the kind of person who didn't believe in the supernatural or the unexplained. Ghost stories, cursed objects, and urban legends were just that, stories. But what happened to me on my last shift at KXPN Radio will haunt me forever. I worked the graveyard shift, midnight to 4 a.m., at a small local station in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't glamorous, but it was quiet, and I liked the solitude. My job was simple: keep the music playing, read the occasional weather report, and field the rare late-night call from an insomniac listener. That night started like any other. The studio was dimly lit, the hum of the equipment comforting in its monotony. I had my usual cup of stale coffee, my playlist queued up, and the weather script ready to read. At exactly 1:13 a.m., the phone rang. It was unusual. Listeners almost never called. I stared at the blinking red light for a moment before picking up. KXPN Late Night Radio. This is Alex. Who's calling? There was a pause. Static crackled on the line, faint but persistent. Hello, I said again, leaning closer to the receiver. A voice finally came through, low and distorted, like it was being dragged across a broken speaker. Do you hear it? Excuse me? I asked, already feeling uneasy. The signal, the voice rasped. It's coming for you. Before I could respond, the line went dead. I shook it off, convincing myself it was a prank. Weird calls happen sometimes. People bored in the middle of the night, trying to spook the lonely DJ. I hung up and went back to the playlist. But then the static started. It was faint at first, creeping into the background of the song playing. I adjusted the controls, thinking it was a technical issue. But no matter what I did, it grew louder, crackling and hissing until it overwhelmed the music entirely. And then it stopped, just as suddenly as it had started. The silence that followed was deafening. I leaned back in my chair, heart pounding, when the studio lights flickered. Once, twice. Then they went out, plunging the room into darkness. I scrambled for my phone, using its weak flashlight to illuminate the room. The equipment was still running, the faint glow of the monitors casting eerie shadows across the walls. But something was wrong. The screen on the main console had changed. Instead of the station's usual logo, it displayed a strange, pulsating pattern, like a heartbeat made of static. And then the voices began. They were faint at first, buried in the static, but they grew louder, more distinct. Dozens of them, speaking over each other in hushed, frantic tones. Don't look, don't turn around. It's here, it's watching. Run, you have to run. I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. My breath came in short, shallow gasps as I stared at the screen, unable to move. The phone rang again. I jumped, nearly dropping my flashlight. The red light on the console blinked insistently. Against my better judgment, I answered. KXPN, I said, my voice trembling. The same distorted voice came through, louder this time. Do you hear it now? What do you want? I whispered. The line crackled, and the voice responded, slow and deliberate. It's not me. It's them. The line went dead, and the studio lights flickered back on. I should have left then and there. I should have grabbed my keys, walked out the door, and never looked back. But I didn't. Something about the voice, about the static, held me in place like a moth drawn to a flame. I sat there, staring at the console, when the static returned, louder and more violent than before. It filled the room, a deafening roar that drowned out my thoughts. And then I saw it, the figure. It stood just beyond the glass window that separated the studio from the hallway, tall and thin, its body distorted as though viewed through warped glass. Its face was obscured, but its eyes, black, empty voids, bored into me. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. All I could do was watch as it raised one long, twisted finger and pointed directly at me. The voices in the static grew louder, their frantic whispers turning into panicked screams. The console screen flashed erratically, displaying images I couldn't comprehend, flashes of faces, places, and something darker, something I couldn't name. And then everything stopped. The lights, the static, the voices, the figure. The studio was silent again, the only sound my ragged breathing. I looked around, half expecting it to reappear, but the room was empty. I grabbed my things and ran, not caring about the station or my shift. I just needed to get out. The next morning, I went back, hoping to find some explanation for what had happened. But the studio was different. The equipment was gone, the room empty and abandoned. I asked the station manager what had happened, and he gave me a confused look. KXPN hasn't broadcasted in years, he said. The station shut down after a fire in '98. You must have the wrong place. I didn't argue. I just nodded and left, my mind racing. I don't know what I experienced that night. Maybe it was a trick of the mind, brought on by exhaustion and isolation. Or maybe it was something else, something older, darker, and far beyond my understanding. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the static again. Faint, just at the edge of my hearing. And sometimes, I think I hear the voices calling my name. They say curiosity killed the cat. For me, it wasn't curiosity exactly, it was boredom. Or maybe it was arrogance, that small voice that tells you nothing can hurt you if you don't believe in it. Either way, it led me to the 7th floor of the Lakeview Apartments, and I've regretted it ever since. I was house-sitting for my friend Jamie, who lived in a tired, gray building that loomed over the edge of town. The place had a strange energy, the kind that made your skin prickle even in broad daylight. Jamie had laughed it off when I mentioned it. "Yeah, people say this building's haunted or whatever," she'd said, rolling her eyes. "But it's just old. Creaky pipes, bad wiring, you know the drill." I nodded, but the unease lingered. Jamie had left for a week-long trip, and I was staying in her apartment on the 4th floor. The first few nights passed without incident, just me, her cat Max, and the endless hum of the city beyond the windows. But on the 4th night, something changed. It started with the sound. At first, I thought it was coming from outside, a faint, rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking on a door. But when I stood by the window, the noise grew fainter, not louder. It wasn't outside. I wandered through the apartment, trying to pinpoint the source. It seemed to be coming from above me, from the ceiling. The 7th floor. Jamie had warned me about the 7th floor. "There's nothing up there anymore," she'd said. "They closed it off years ago. Some kind of structural issue. Anyway, don't try to go up there. The elevator doesn't stop on 7, and the stairwell's locked." I'd shrugged it off at the time, but now, with the tapping growing louder, her warning echoed in my mind. I could have ignored it. I should have ignored it. But something about the sound was maddening, persistent and deliberate, like it was meant for me. I grabbed a flashlight and headed to the stairwell. The door to the 7th floor was locked, just as Jamie had said. But the lock was old, the metal corroded and brittle. It didn't take much effort to force it open. The hallway beyond was dark, the air thick with dust and decay. My flashlight beam cut through the shadows, revealing peeling wallpaper and cracked tiles. The tapping had stopped. I stepped inside, the floor creaking under my weight. The silence was oppressive, pressing down on me like a physical weight. And then I saw it. A door at the end of the hallway, slightly ajar. Light seeped through the crack, faint and flickering like candlelight. I should have turned around right then. But something about the door drew me closer, as if an invisible hand was guiding me. The air grew colder with each step, and by the time I reached the door, my breath was visible in the beam of my flashlight. I pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest. The room was wrong. It was small and bare, the walls painted a sickly shade of yellow. A single chair sat in the center, facing the far wall. The light came from a bulb dangling from the ceiling, its weak glow casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. But it wasn't the room that terrified me. It was what was written on the walls. Every inch of the yellow paint was covered in writing, jagged, chaotic scrawls that overlapped and twisted together. Words, sentences, names. And then I saw mine. "Alex, don't turn around." My heart stopped. The flashlight trembled in my hand as I read it again. My name, written over and over in uneven lines. And then I heard it, breathing, shallow and ragged, coming from directly behind me. I wanted to run, to scream, but I couldn't move. My body was frozen, locked in place by some invisible force. Slowly, painfully, I turned my head. There was nothing there. The door slammed shut behind me, and the light bulb began to flicker wildly. The shadows on the walls twisted and writhed, taking on shapes that defied logic. Faces, hands, eyes, and then the chair moved. It scraped against the floor, spinning slowly to face me. And for the first time, I realized I wasn't alone. A figure sat in the chair, its body impossibly thin and hunched. Its face was obscured by long, matted hair, but its eyes, deep, empty sockets, locked onto mine. It raised a hand, skeletal and clawed, and pointed at the wall behind me. I turned, my heart hammering in my chest. The writing had changed. The walls were blank except for one phrase, scrawled in fresh, dripping red. "You should not have come." The figure stood, its movements jerky and unnatural. It took a step toward me, and I stumbled backward, slamming into the door. The light bulb burst, plunging the room into darkness. And then the voice. Low and guttural, it whispered directly into my ear. "Leave. Now." I don't know how I found the strength to move, but I did. I threw the door open and ran, not caring where I was going. The hallway stretched endlessly before me, the walls seeming to close in. Somehow, I made it to the stairwell. The 7th floor door slammed shut behind me, the sound echoing in the empty building. Jamie found me the next morning, curled up on her couch, shaking and incoherent. I tried to explain, but she didn't believe me. "No one's been up there in years," she said. "You imagined it. But I know what I saw. I moved out of town a week later, but the nightmares haven't stopped. Sometimes, I wake up to the sound of tapping on my walls, faint and rhythmic. And sometimes, I hear the voice again, whispering from the darkness. You should not have come." I never believed the stories about Black Hollow. Every small town has its legends, and ours was no different. A cursed forest, they said. People who entered never came back, or if they did, they were changed. It sounded ridiculous, but the town was obsessed with it. No one ventured near the forest. Even the most skeptical locals wouldn't speak of it after dark. I thought it was all nonsense. That's probably why I agreed to the dare. It was a cold autumn night when my friends convinced me to go. Jack, Rachel, and I were sitting around a bonfire when the idea came up. "Come on, Sam," Jack said, grinning. "You're always saying the stories are fake. Prove it. Just spend an hour in Black Hollow. We'll wait for you at the edge." I laughed. "What's so scary about some trees?" Rachel frowned, glancing toward the dark line of trees in the distance. "It's not just trees. People say the forest moves, that it watches you." "Don't tell me you believe that," I teased. Rachel didn't respond, and Jack handed me a flashlight. "Go on then. Unless you're scared." I wasn't scared. Not yet. The forest was silent. Not the peaceful kind of silence you find in nature. The heavy, suffocating kind that presses against your ears. The first thing I noticed was the air. It smelled wrong, like damp earth and something metallic. The second thing I noticed was the cold. It was freezing, far colder than it had been outside. I turned on the flashlight, its beam cutting through the dark. The trees were tall and gnarled, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands. I walked for what felt like 20 minutes, deeper into the forest. My friends had dared me to stay an hour, but I was already planning to cut it short. The place was unsettling, even if I didn't believe in curses. That's when I heard it, a soft rustling, like leaves moving in the wind. Except there was no wind. "Hello!" I called out, my voice shaky. The rustling stopped. I turned in a slow circle, shining the flashlight into the shadows. Nothing moved, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept walking, trying to ignore the growing unease in my chest. But the further I went, the stranger things became. The trees began to look identical, no matter which direction I turned. The path I thought I'd been following vanished, replaced by thick undergrowth. My footprints in the soft dirt were gone. And then I noticed the whispers. They were faint at first, barely audible over the sound of my own breathing. But as I moved, they grew louder. Dozens of voices, overlapping in a language I didn't understand. "Who's there?" I shouted, spinning around. The forest answered with silence. I decided I'd had enough. I turned and began walking back the way I'd come, or at least, what I thought was the way back. But no matter how far I walked, the trees didn't change. And then I saw it. A tree in the distance, its trunk marked with deep, jagged scratches. It looked like an animal's claw marks, but something about them was too deliberate. As I approached, I felt a wave of nausea. The air grew heavier, and the metallic smell became overpowering. There was something carved into the tree, just below the scratches. A word. "Sam." I stumbled back, the flashlight shaking in my hand. No way." Behind me, the whispers started again, louder and more insistent. I turned, and for the first time I saw them. Figures stood in the shadows between the trees, their bodies thin and stretched unnaturally tall. Their faces were blank, no eyes, no mouths, just smooth, pale skin. They didn't move, but I knew they were watching me. I ran. Branches tore at my clothes and skin as I sprinted through the forest, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly. The whispers followed me, growing louder, overlapping until they became a deafening roar. And then I tripped. I hit the ground hard, the flashlight flying out of my hand. Darkness swallowed me as I scrambled to my feet, panic surging through me. When I found the flashlight, it was lying in front of another tree. This one was different, its bark blackened and cracked. And on it was another word: stay. The voices fell silent, and the forest seemed to hold its breath. A hand, cold and impossibly strong, clamped down on my shoulder. I don't remember how I got out of Black Hollow. One moment, I was surrounded by darkness, and the next, I was stumbling out of the trees, gasping for air. Jack and Rachel were waiting for me, their faces pale. "You were gone for hours," Rachel said, her voice shaking. "We thought you." "I don't want to talk about it," I interrupted, my voice hollow. They didn't press me, and I never told them what happened. But sometimes late at night, I hear the whispers again, soft and distant, calling my name. And I know one thing for certain: the forest isn't done with me. I've always enjoyed driving at night. There's something calming about the hum of the engine, the empty roads, and the cool night air filtering through the window. It's peaceful, or at least it used to be. That night, I was heading home from a business trip, driving down a long, desolate highway that stretched endlessly through the countryside. The clock on the dashboard read 2:13 a.m., and the only light came from my headlights and the occasional crescent moon that peeked through the clouds. The road was silent, save for the faint static of the radio. I had tried to find a station earlier, but nothing came through, so I left it on out of habit. Somewhere around mile marker 42, I saw her. A woman standing by the side of the road, her figure illuminated by the beams of my headlights. She was wearing a pale dress, the fabric fluttering slightly in the breeze, and her long hair hung loose around her face. I slowed down instinctively, my first thought being that her car had broken down. But as I got closer, something about her posture unsettled me. She was too still, almost unnaturally so, her head tilted slightly as if listening for something. When I pulled up beside her, she turned to face me. Her face was pale, almost ghostly in the glow of my headlights. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and there was something in them that made my chest tighten, fear, or maybe something worse. I rolled down the window a few inches. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" She didn't answer right away, just stared at me with those wide, unnerving eyes. Finally, she nodded. "Can you give me a ride?" she asked, her voice soft and almost too faint to hear. I hesitated. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to drive away, but leaving her alone on a road like this didn't sit right with me either. "Sure," I said finally. "Get in." She slid into the passenger seat, her movements stiff and mechanical. As she buckled her seatbelt, I caught a faint whiff of something metallic, like old coins or blood. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just further down the road," she said, not looking at me. Her vague answer sent a chill down my spine, but I didn't press her. I put the car back in gear and started driving. For a while, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the rumble of the engine and the faint static from the radio. I glanced at her out of the corner of my eye. She was staring straight ahead, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. That's when the static changed. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then I heard it clearly. A voice, faint and distorted, breaking through the interference. "You shouldn't have stopped." I froze, my grip tightening on the wheel. The voice was gone as quickly as it had come, replaced by the familiar hum of static. I glanced at her again. She hadn't reacted, as if she hadn't heard it. "So, I said, trying to shake off the unease. "What happened back there? Did your car break down?" She didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I was waiting," she said. "For what?" "For you." My heart skipped a beat. I laughed nervously, hoping I'd misheard her. "What do you mean?" She turned to look at me, and for the first time, I noticed the faint smudge of red on the side of her neck. "Do you hear it?" she asked, her voice flat. "Hear what?" Before she could answer, the radio crackled again, louder this time. "She's not what you think. Turn back now." The car swerved slightly as I struggled to keep control. My chest felt tight, and my breathing quickened. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. She didn't respond. Instead, she smiled, a small, cold smile that didn't reach her eyes. The miles dragged on, the road stretching endlessly before us. I checked the clock again. 2:13 a.m. That didn't make sense. It should have been closer to 2:30 by now. The unease in my chest grew stronger. The radio hissed, the static growing louder and more erratic. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw her hands, pale and thin, clutching at the fabric of her dress. Her nails were dark, as if stained with something. "Where do you need me to drop you off?" I asked, my voice shaking. She didn't answer. Instead, she turned her head slowly, her eyes locking onto mine. "You shouldn't have stopped," she said. The car veered violently as I slammed on the brakes. I turned to look at her, but the passenger seat was empty. Panic surged through me as I scanned the road and the surrounding darkness. She was gone. I hit the gas, desperate to get away, but the road stretched on endlessly, the same mile marker flashing past again and again. The radio crackled one last time, the distorted voice cutting through the static. "It's too late now." And then I saw her again, standing in the middle of the road, her pale dress glowing in the headlights. This time, she was smiling. I don't remember what happened after that. I woke up the next morning in my car, parked on the side of the road. The passenger seat was empty, but the faint metallic smell lingered in the air. When I checked the clock, it was 2:13 a.m. I haven't driven at night since. But sometimes, when I'm alone, I hear static crackling faintly in the distance. And I know she's still waiting. I found it in an old leather-bound journal at a flea market on the edge of town. The vendor was a hunched, gray-haired man with cloudy eyes and a voice like dry leaves scraping the ground. "You don't want that," he said when I picked it up. "Why not?" I asked, flipping through its brittle pages. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned his back on me and shuffled away, leaving me alone with the journal. Inside was a map. It was crude, hand-drawn, and covered in strange symbols. At the center was a circle, labeled in uneven, jagged handwriting, the City of Bones. Beneath it was a single sentence, written in the same trembling script. "Those who enter do not leave unbroken." I should have put the journal down. I should have walked away. But something about the map pulled me in, something I couldn't explain. 3 days later, I was driving through the desert, following the map's crude directions. The sun had long since set, and the world around me was swallowed by darkness. The road was little more than a dirt trail, and my headlights barely pierced the thick, inky blackness ahead. The further I went, the more I began to feel it, a growing sense of unease, like I was being watched. The desert was empty, but the feeling wouldn't leave me. Finally I saw it. A sign, weathered and leaning precariously to one side, its letters barely legible in the faint glow of my headlights. "Welcome to Asura, the City of Bones." The town was silent. The buildings were ancient, their wood cracked and bleached white by the relentless sun. The streets were covered in a fine layer of dust, untouched by footprints or tire tracks. As I stepped out of the car, the air seemed to grow colder. The silence was absolute, oppressive, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I walked through the empty streets, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. Every building was abandoned, their windows shattered and their doors hanging open. And then I saw them. Bones. They were scattered everywhere, piles of them in the corners of buildings, lining the streets, even hanging from the skeletal remains of what had once been lamp posts. Human bones. My stomach churned as I realized the sheer volume of them. Hundreds, maybe thousands, bleached white and brittle with age. The map had led me here, to the heart of this desolate, macabre town. And at the center of it all was the circle, a clearing surrounded by towering stone pillars, just as the map had shown. As I stepped into the circle, the air grew colder still. My breath came out in visible puffs, and the flashlight flickered, its beam dimming. I should have turned back. I should have run. But something compelled me to stay. At the center of the circle was a single massive bone, a femur, as thick as a tree trunk. Carved into its surface were symbols, similar to those on the map. I reached out to touch it, and the moment my fingers brushed the surface, the ground trembled. A low, guttural sound echoed through the air, like the groan of something ancient awakening. And then I heard them. Footsteps. They emerged from the shadows, one by one. Figures made entirely of bone, their skeletal frames held together by some unseen force. Their empty sockets glowed faintly with a sickly green light, and their movements were slow but deliberate. They surrounded me, their heads tilted as if examining me. One stepped forward, taller than the others, its skull adorned with jagged, broken horns. "Why have you come?" it asked, its voice a hollow whisper that seemed to echo inside my skull. I don't know," I stammered, backing away. "You have entered the City of Bones," it continued, ignoring my fear. "None leave unbroken." "What does that mean?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The horned figure didn't answer. Instead, it reached out a bony hand, its fingers impossibly long and sharp. The moment it touched my chest, a wave of pain shot through me, and I fell to my knees. Visions flooded my mind. I saw the town as it once was, alive, thriving. People walked the streets, their laughter echoing through the air. But then came the plague. It wasn't a disease of the body, but of the soul. One by one, the townsfolk succumbed, their bodies collapsing into piles of bones. But their spirits remained, trapped within the skeletal remains of their former selves. The city of bones was their prison, and now it was mine. The vision ended, and I was back in the circle, surrounded by the skeletal figures. "You have been marked," the horned figure said. "You belong to the city now." "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "I don't belong here. Let me go." The figure tilted its head, as if amused. "You may leave, but you will never be free." I don't remember how I got out of Asura. One moment I was in the circle, and the next I was stumbling back to my car, gasping for air. The town was gone, replaced by endless desert. But the mark remains, a jagged scar on my chest, faintly glowing in the dark. And at night, I hear them, the whispers of the bone figures, calling me back to the city. I know I can't escape them. Not forever. The house was supposed to be a fresh start. After years of renting cramped apartments in the city, I finally saved enough to buy my own place. A modest, two-bedroom house on the outskirts of a quiet little town. The price was almost too good to be true, but I didn't question it. I was desperate to escape the noise and chaos of urban life. The house had charm, with its creaky wooden floors and ivy-covered brick exterior. Sure, it needed a little work, but that was part of the appeal. A project to keep me busy, something to call my own. The first night, however, I noticed the bugs. It started small. As I unpacked boxes in the kitchen, I spotted a single ant scurrying across the counter. I grabbed a paper towel and squashed it without much thought. By the time I went to bed, I'd killed 3 more. The next morning, I woke up to find a line of them marching along the baseboard. They trailed from the back door to the pantry, where I'd left an open box of crackers. I sighed, annoyed but not overly concerned. Bugs were to be expected in an old house, especially one that had been sitting empty for a while. I cleaned up the crumbs, sprayed some repellent, and sealed up any cracks I could find. That seemed to do the trick, for a while. A week later, I started hearing noises. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, creaks and groans in the walls, the kind you get used to in older homes. But as the days went by, the sounds became more distinct. Scratching, skittering. It always started at night, just as I was drifting off to sleep. The faint, rapid tapping of tiny legs on wood, moving inside the walls. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just mice. Still, I called an exterminator the next day. When he arrived, he inspected the house thoroughly, checking every nook and cranny. After an hour, he emerged from the crawlspace, his face pale and his brow slick with sweat. "You've got a problem," he said. "No kidding," I replied. "What is it? Termites? Rats?" He hesitated, wiping his hands on his pants. "It's bigger than that. I've never seen anything like it. I think you need a specialist." "What kind of specialist?" I asked, but he didn't answer. He just packed up his tools and left without another word. That night, the scratching was louder than ever. I lay in bed, clutching the sheets, my eyes wide open and my heart pounding. The sound wasn't just in the walls anymore. It was above me in the ceiling. And then, just as I was about to get up, a single insect dropped onto the pillow beside me. It was a beetle, shiny and black, with legs that twitched and writhed as it tried to right itself. I froze, staring at it in horror. That's when the ceiling cracked. It started as a small fissure, barely noticeable. But within seconds, it spread, the drywall splitting apart with a sickening crunch. And then they came. Hundreds of insects poured out of the ceiling, beetles, ants, spiders, and things I couldn't even identify. They rained down in a living, writhing mass covering the bed, the floor, and me. I screamed, flailing as I tried to brush them off, but it was useless. They were everywhere, crawling up my legs, my arms, my face. In the chaos, I stumbled out of the room, slamming the door behind me. My skin itched and burned, phantom sensations of legs and pincers still crawling over me. I spent the rest of the night in my car, trembling and staring at the darkened house. The next day, I called another exterminator. When he arrived, I led him to the bedroom, but the room was spotless. The cracks in the ceiling were gone. There were no insects, no evidence of the nightmare from the night before. "Are you sure it wasn't just a bad dream?" he asked, his tone skeptical. I wanted to argue, but I couldn't. The room looked perfectly normal, as if nothing had happened. Still, I insisted he spray the entire house. That night, the scratching returned. But this time, it wasn't in the walls or the ceiling. It was coming from beneath the floor. I stared at the hardwood, my chest tightening with dread. The sound grew louder, more insistent, until I couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing a crowbar, I pried up one of the floorboards. What I saw underneath made my stomach turn. It wasn't just bugs. It was a hive. The space beneath the floor was packed with them. Thousands of insects writhing and squirming in a pulsating mass, their bodies interwoven with some kind of sickly, yellowish substance. At the center of it all was something larger. A queen. It was massive, easily the size of a dog, its bloated body glistening in the dim light. Its legs twitched as it turned its eyeless head toward me, its mandibles clicking together. And then it spoke. "You should not have come here." The voice wasn't human. It was a low, chittering sound that seemed to echo in my mind. I dropped the crowbar and stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. "This house belongs to us," it continued. "You will not leave." I ran. I didn't stop to grab anything, not my keys, not my wallet, not even my shoes. I just bolted out the door and kept running until my legs gave out. It's been weeks since I left the house. I've been staying in a motel, too afraid to go back. Every night, I dream of the insects. I feel them crawling on my skin, hear their whispers in my ears. And every morning, when I wake up, I find tiny bite marks on my arms and legs. I know they're still with me. I don't think they'll ever let me go. It started with a dream. Or at least, I thought it was a dream. I was walking down a corridor, a long, endless hallway with walls that seemed to stretch and breathe, like they were alive. The light above flickered, casting shadows that danced and twisted in unnatural ways. Somewhere ahead of me, I heard a faint humming, like the buzz of an old television. I couldn't place where it was coming from, but it felt wrong, like it didn't belong. And then I saw her. She stood at the end of the hallway, her back to me, motionless. Her long hair hung limply over her shoulders, and her hands dangled at her sides. I called out to her, my voice echoing unnaturally in the narrow space. "Hey, are you okay?" She didn't respond. I took a step closer, then another, and that's when she turned around. Her face, if you could call it that, wasn't human. It was distorted, twisted, her eyes black voids that seemed to suck the light from the air. Her mouth opened impossibly wide, and from it came the same buzzing sound I'd heard before, louder now, almost deafening. I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. At first, I told myself it was just a nightmare. Stress, maybe. A side effect of the long hours I'd been putting in at work. But then it happened again. And again. Every night, I found myself in that hallway, the buzzing growing louder, the shadows darker. Every night, she was there, waiting for me. But it wasn't just in my dreams. The buzzing followed me into the waking world. I'd hear it faintly in the background while I worked, like static just out of reach. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then it started getting louder, sharper, more insistent. One day, while I was sitting in a meeting at work, it became unbearable. I clutched my head, trying to block out the sound, but it was inside me, vibrating through my skull. "Are you okay?" someone asked, their voice distant, muffled. I looked up, and for a brief moment, I saw her face. Not on the person speaking, but behind them, like a ghostly reflection in a warped mirror. I screamed. Things only got worse after that. I started seeing her everywhere, in mirrors, in windows, in the corners of rooms where the shadows gathered. She never moved, never spoke. She just stared at me with those empty, black eyes. I couldn't focus. I stopped going to work, stopped answering my phone. The buzzing was constant now, a relentless drone that drowned out my thoughts. Desperate for answers, I started digging into my past, looking for anything that might explain what was happening to me. That's when I found the photos. The photos were in an old shoebox buried in the back of my closet. They were of me as a child, no older than 7 or 8. In most of them, I was playing in the backyard, smiling at the camera. But in the background of one photo, I saw her. She was standing at the edge of the yard, half hidden behind a tree, her dark, hollow eyes staring straight at the camera. I felt my stomach twist as I stared at the photo. I didn't remember her. I didn't remember any of this. But she had been there. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room, clutching the photo, my heart pounding. The buzzing was louder than ever, vibrating through the walls, the floor, my very bones. And then the lights went out. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The buzzing stopped, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. And then I heard it, a voice. It was faint, distorted, like a whisper carried on static. "You let me in." I turned, my eyes darting around the darkened room. "Who's there?" There was no response, only the sound of footsteps, soft, deliberate, coming from the hallway. I stood, backing away as the footsteps grew louder, closer. My heart raced, and every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. She stepped out of the shadows. This time she spoke. "You've been dreaming of me," she said, her voice layered, like multiple people speaking at once. "But I've been here all along. What do you want?" I whispered, my voice shaking. Her head tilted, her black eyes glinting in the faint light. "It's not what I want. It's what you want. You opened the door." "I didn't." "You did," she interrupted, her tone sharp. "You thought about me. You let me in." I tried to back away, but the room seemed to stretch, the walls bending and warping around me. "You can't escape me," she said, stepping closer. "I'm in your thoughts now. I'm part of you." Her hand reached out, and the moment her fingers touched my temple, my vision went black. When I woke up, I was back in the hallway. The walls were alive, pulsating, and the buzzing was deafening. She stood at the end, waiting for me. This time, I didn't call out. I didn't move. She smiled, her mouth stretching impossibly wide. "You're home," she said, and then she stepped forward, the shadows swallowing her whole. I haven't woken up since. The buzzing is constant, her voice always in my head. I don't know where I am, or if I'm even still alive. All I know is that she's here, and she's never leaving. I never believed in ghosts or curses. Supernatural things always felt like stories people told to scare themselves or explain what they didn't understand. But that was before I found the mirror. It was a rainy Saturday when I stumbled across it at an antique shop tucked away in the forgotten corner of town. The shop smelled like mildew and old wood, and the air felt heavy, as if time itself hung suspended in the room. The mirror caught my eye immediately. Its frame was intricately carved, depicting vines that twisted into grotesque faces if you looked too closely. The glass was slightly warped, giving reflections an odd, unsettling quality. "It's beautiful," I said, running my fingers along the frame. The shopkeeper, a gaunt man with sunken eyes, appeared out of nowhere. "That mirror," he said slowly, "has a history." I should have asked more. I should have listened when he told me, in a low, trembling voice, that it came from an old house where terrible things had happened. But I laughed it off, thinking he was just trying to drive up the price. I bought it for next to nothing and brought it home. The first night, nothing happened. I hung the mirror in my bedroom, admiring how it gave the space a vintage charm. It wasn't until the second night that I noticed something strange. As I was getting ready for bed, I glanced at the mirror. For a moment, my reflection didn't match my movements. I tilted my head left, but in the glass I tilted right. I blinked, rubbing my eyes. When I looked again, everything seemed normal. "Just tired," I muttered, crawling into bed. That night, I dreamed of the mirror. In the dream, I was standing in front of it, staring at my reflection. But the person staring back wasn't me. Her eyes were darker, her skin pale and waxy, her lips twisted into a cruel smile. She pressed her hand against the glass, and when I reached out to touch it, I felt her fingers curl around mine. I woke up screaming. Over the next few days, the mirror became wrong. I started noticing shadows moving in it that didn't exist in the room. At first, they were faint, just the flicker of something passing behind me. But soon, they grew darker, more defined. One evening, as I brushed my hair in front of the mirror, I saw her again. The woman from my dream. She stood behind me, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, her black eyes fixed on mine. I spun around, but the room was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, she was gone. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination. Stress, lack of sleep, but the occurrences became harder to ignore. Objects reflected in the mirror didn't match what was in the room. My reflection would sometimes move when I stood perfectly still. One night, as I stared at the mirror, the lights flickered. For a split second, my reflection smiled, a wide, sinister grin, though my face remained neutral. I covered the mirror with a blanket and left the room, my heart pounding. But the blanket didn't stay. The next morning, I found it crumpled on the floor, the mirror exposed. I decided to get rid of it. I dragged the mirror to the garage and leaned it against the wall. As I turned to leave, I heard it, a faint tapping. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. Slowly, I turned back to the mirror. The woman was there, her hands pressed against the glass, her eyes locked onto mine. "Let me out," she whispered, her voice echoing inside my head. I stumbled back, grabbing a hammer from the workbench. With a scream, I swung it at the mirror. The glass shattered, fragments flying everywhere. For a moment, the room was silent. And then I heard it. Laughter. I thought it was over. I thought breaking the mirror would free me. But now she's everywhere. I see her in every reflection, in windows, in puddles, even in my own eyes. She's always there, smiling, watching. And at night, when I close my eyes, I feel her fingers brushing against my face. She's out now, and she's not going back.